Hello, listeners. We are coming to you live as usual, although perhaps not while you watch it. And with this week, we haven't been doing this weekly lately. This week, but this week's episode, which is our 10th episode of season 2, you'll be hearing 2 excerpts from my sister Casey, older sister. For those who didn't know, I know she looks so young, but she's my older sister. But Casey, tell us a bit before you start about the 2 stories you'll be presenting today.
Well, so the theme is castles. I recently went on a castle tour of Germany with my fiance and what is effectively our honeymoon because we are out of money.
So that is pre and post moon.
Yeah, pre moon, post moon. It's like the rising. It's sort of the sunset. Or sunrise, whatever comes before years. Whatever comes before the moon, but doesn't sound depressing, is what. Yeah, it's a prequel. Yes, sort of a prequel, we'll call it. But yeah, and people really like castles. Castles are really popular things that come up all the time, and so these 2 stories are about castles, or they exploit certain aspects of the setting of castles or what have you. But I was wondering, like, what do you think castles are interesting? What do you think of when you think of castles? Or why do you think, if you're not interested, why do you think so many people are?
Well, you can approach castles from a lot of different ways. So when I was in 6th grade, I was really, really cool because I had a subscription to Architectural Digest and no friends. And and no, but I love that magazine, and I thought it was the most awesome thing because I was going through my architectural phase. So architecturally, castles I think are fascinating because I don't know why. I guess they're just really fascinating, but they're also very theatrical. They're very romantic. You tie them into the Middle Ages, which is, I think, most Westerners associate with that. The Dark Ages, the mysterious kind of the unknown, the witches and the witch hunts and religious lawlessness kind of deal. So there's a lot of mystique and kind of like sorcery and magic and areas. So it ties in with fantasy and it ties in with the kind of really dark and intriguing and mysterious era of human history. And Dracula, you can't really talk about without thinking about castles. And I don't know, it just has that. I think it's a solid symbol of that murky area of history and literature and fantasy and fairy tale. So that would be my convoluted explanation to your question, but I can't say what someone else's would be.
No, I think that's a really good way of approaching it. Is that, yeah, there's something about it evokes a certain notion of fairy tale or magic, and that can be a sinister, dark, treacherous Dracula kind of magic, or it can be something much more like damsels in distress and knights in shining armor, and you could Disneyfy it as much as you want.
Right, and I mean, there is a reason that's the symbol that is the trademark symbol for Disneyland is what? A castle.
The castle. Yeah. So yeah, we'll get more into that observation actually, which is really interesting after this. So these are 2 castle stories. One is mine and one is not. I will begin. The sun streams in through the western windows and across the great mahogany hall. It suffuses in an embery glow the floating dust and the tapestry of Sir Eberhard, felling the last toothless dragon as the latter flopped away in cumbrous abdication of the mountain. The dethroned king strides resolutely down the corridor, passing without pause this gallant scene, once the fascination of his boyhood. Nor does he glance upwards, as his father had so often done, discreetly, when in the presence of his saint-like wife, to the domed ceiling where a circle of naked ladies still dance their demented dance, amid ferns and swans and stippled ribbons and what appears to be a monkey on a leash. The dethroned king then ascends the tower, followed only by the fluttering hem of his velvet blue cape, the ornamented scabbard of his saber, and his loyal psychiatrist. Once arrived in the oriel, with shapely yet regal hand, the dethroned king takes hold of the shaft of his telescope, swings it gently southward, and peering through the silver-coated lens across the valley of his ancestors, he observes the skeletal construction rising up along the ridge. His daily session of constructional supervision has begun. The dethroned king leans back into his armchair, pulls the telescope close to him, loosens his belt, and settles into the folds of blue velvet. The vision on the other end of the telescope is almost as marvelous as he dreamt it. Cylindrical turrets rise up above the tree lines. Scaffolding wraps around the delicate spindly towers. A delicate, almost spidery latticework of stone climaxes in narrow, conical roofs unthinkably high above the valley, while along the smooth, impenetrable walls, bas-reliefs of great stone knights prepare to keep their vigil of 1,000 years. And as cart after cart drags slabs of white marble up the mountainside, the towers, and indeed the whole mountain itself, seems to throb like a living organism of pulleys and wagons, architects and surveyors, stonemasons, carpenters, plumbers, and electricians brought in especially from England to install a lighting and telephone system. All afternoon, the dethroned king somberly patrols the erection of this, his greatest achievement, his plaything, his fortress, his mausoleum. In the corner, the psychiatrist takes careful note of his patient's smallest gestures, the rapidity of his pulse, and his accelerated breathing. Whenever the dethroned king mutters something such as, "I shall have a sink in the form of a silver swan," or "My bedchamber will be a cathedral," or "I alone shall enter the throne room," or "My enemies have no honor," the psychiatrist takes careful note of these as well. And tonight, after the dethroned king sinks into a deep and drugged sleep, he will analyze the physical, spiritual, and political implications of each phrase at length, including them all in his typewritten report to the committee. It's the end of excerpt 1. Question?
Okay. No, not at this time.
Okay.
Proceed.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Proceed to more that I may analyze. As the psychiatrist.
You just fall so naturally into that role. The castle, that is, the main massing of original stone, taken by itself, would have displayed a certain ponderous architectural quality, were it possible to have ignored the circumfusion of those mean dwellings that swarmed like an epidemic around its outer walls. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbor until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels laid hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like limpets to a rock. These dwellings, by ancient law, were granted this chill intimacy with the stronghold that loomed above them. Over their irregular roofs would fall throughout the seasons the shadows of time-eaten buttresses, of broken and lofty turrets, and most enormous of all, the shadow of the Tower of Flints. This tower, patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fist of knuckled masonry and pointed blasphemously at heaven. Very little communication passed between the denizens of these outer quarters and those who lived within the walls, save when, on the first June morning of each year, the entire population of the clay dwellings had sanctioned to enter the grounds in order to display the wooden carvings on which they had been working during the year. The competition among them to display the finest objects of the year was bitter and rapid. Their sole passion was directed, once their days of love had guttered, on the production of this wooden sculpture, and among the muddle of huts at the foot of the outer wall existed a score of creative craftsmen whose position as leading carvers gave them pride of place among the shadows. Those works judged to be the most consummate, chosen, were subsequently relegated to the Hall of the Bright Carvings. The carvings that were left unselected were burned the same evening in the courtyard below the Earl's western balcony, and it was customary for him to stand there at the time of the burning and to bow his head silently as if in pain. And then, as a gong beat thrice from within, the 3 carvings to escape the flames would be brought forth in the moonlight. They were stood upon the balustrade of the balcony in full view of the crowd below, and the Earl would call for their authors to come forward. When they had stationed themselves immediately beneath where he was standing, the Earl would throw down to them the traditional scrolls, which, as the writings upon them verified, permitted those men to walk the battlements over their cantonment at the full moon of each alternate month. End of excerpt 2.
One moment while I complete these notes. And Danielle, hello and welcome home, honey, to my spouse who's just walked in the door.
It's been documented. You do it.
I do.
The internet knows that you're a good wife.
I am a good wife. The good wife.
It sounds so menacing. The Good Wife could only be the title of like a horror movie.
It is the title of a horror movie by Stephen King.
Mm-hmm. The Good Wife?
The Good Wife.
Ah, well, see, there you go.
She doesn't realize that she's married to a serial killer. But she is. And then she does.
I thought he wouldn't realize that he was married to a serial killer because she seems like such a good wife.
No, that's a different horror film about a housewife mommy type that is actually becomes a pathological serial killer.
I can see that taking place.
Darling, could you close the office door, please? Sorry, brief interlude, and then I will get to commenting on both of these stories.
So any
Thank you.
question?
You noted initially, and I can't remember if you said this whilst we were live or in our build-up. For our listeners who don't know, we talk a bit before we start these. We talk about you before we start telling you things. You said that there was a kind of dark psychological components to both of these stories, which in the first one to me seemed very overt, and then the second one seemed present but approached in a different manner. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
I don't think I said that they both had a dark psychological dimension, but it was just interesting to think about the different ways or the different reasons that castles fascinate, or how they act upon people's fantasies, or what they do, basically what a castle does in a story or in an image or whatever. So I think in the first, you have a person who is whose fascination, which may or may not have brought him to the point of a form of, I don't know if madness, but perhaps, highly neurotic behavior, is building castles. And he seems to be doing that in an era in which castles coexist with more modern things like a psychiatrist, which is a 19th century phenomenon.
And
telephones. There are things like that. So there's a sense of like a certain untimeliness. But he is a king. He's a dethroned king. So one of the things that is kind of implied and not entirely clear is, if that's, if that's his part of his fantasy, or if that's the case, and how that overlap of like modern world and the castle fantasy kind of exists. So like what castles are is like libidinal fantasies, let's say, because it seems to be like a voyeuristic or kind of almost erotic fixation that he seems to have with it.
Definitely erotic.
Yes. There's an erotic like dimension for sure. And then in the second one, I think what's really interesting is that it takes the castle and what is a castle? Well, it's a fortress, so it's supposed to keep certain people in and certain people out, and that's its basic function. In a world in which there's not really much rule of law, that's what castles are for. And so you get a sense it approaches the castle not like within with the family and royalty and things like that, but you get a sense of like these almost like macabre or exaggerated hovels or clay dwellers, or it's almost like this Neanderthal primitive existence. And then they have this one highly ritualized, controlled encounter with the people within. So it's perhaps more I don't know if I would call it Marxist, but there's a sense of like the very stark class division between those who are without the castle and then those who are within. And there's also a sense of time having passed. So it's a ruin, it's a dark place. It's patched with black ivy and the time-eaten buttresses and things like that. So its temporality is a little bit hard to pin down.
Mm.
Whereas in the first one, I think that you get a slightly clearer sense of when it's going on.
Right.
If that answers your question.
Yes. Well, I thought that the play between the two was pretty interesting. Components that really stuck out to me between the two, definitely in the first one, I thought that the language, the very sexual language and the description of the architectural components of the building, as well as the people who were putting effort into the building. I wrote down a couple words when I started catching on to the climax of the constellations, the erection of the scaffoldings, how it was his plaything, and he would look on it with accelerated breathing, and even other elements like the different fabrics that he was wearing and sinking into the velvet, and all of these different textile clues. And then of course you read into the kind of Freudian psychotherapy element of the psychiatrists and their analysis and the sexual components. I don't know. I thought it was kind of a cool way of looking on a castle. And then with the second one, the component that I found most fascinating was there wasn't really much emphasis put on people in terms of personalities. You have the population and you have the ruler, the earl, or whomever. But those are actually there's not too much going on there. Mm-hmm. They're subject to the real personalities of that excerpt, which are those of the structures of the castle and of the dwellings surrounding the castle. Those are the real kind of personalities at play.
Yeah.
And everything seems to focus around that in the second one.
I find that like to be very interesting, just of like anything that deals with aristocratic families in general. Like you could even, I don't particularly like Downton Abbey, but I think you can even see it in something like Downton Abbey, where like if you belong to a long lineage and there's an estate, then your sense of time, like let's say this belonged to your family for 800 years and you're the current occupant, but you are kind of an extension or an expression, like just one branch on like a much bigger system. And so the actual individual or the personality is generally eclipsed unless something really dramatic happened. And it's usually it's the family or the estate or the castle that like persists. It's got this kind of institutional, like larger than life, almost like quasi-eternal quality. And it totally, it makes the development of like complex personalities like kind of different, because what's really governing what everyone does is ritual and persistence and tradition and things like that. And you can see how after a while that would just kind of eat the life out of it, because I'm not sure to what extent that can be healthily sustained, and it seems like it would breed a lot of like depressed and melancholic and neurotic behavior.
Well, one of the more memorable explorations into that theme that I remember, and you've read it too, is in Orlando.
Yeah.
When Orlando, he and then she has this massive castle or manor with these many rooms, and the effort that goes into maintaining and developing that, and at one point kind of being controlled by it in the Victorian area in terms of like the drafts but that's more of like a social commentary. But still, it kind of explores that that theme as well, I think, in an
For
interesting
sure.
way.
I mean, I think that the character of Orlando, for example, who kind of lives, it's never explained why Orlando never dies. Orlando just keeps living through these various eras and keeps kind of
At about the age of
changing.
30, from what I could gather.
Yeah, yeah. So there's this, for some reason, like life does not develop for Orlando the way it does for other people, but it makes sense for like a European aristocrat. Like, I think if it was a different kind of person, then it would be more of a stretch. But somehow you don't even ever need it explained for that book to work. So yeah,
No, I think it requires that it not be explained for that book to work.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. But usually people like, if something supernatural is occurring, then people like to know, kind of have a sense of why or what its causality is. But yeah, so.
No, so it made me think of that a little bit. But no, I thought that it was really interesting that the personalities of the structures themselves, of the dark and foreboding castle, and the clamping clay dwellings that kind of
Yeah.
fed off of it, almost, like in the way it made you think of, like maybe even animals that are interacting with each other, some sort of symbiotic bottom feeder relationship was happening, where the actual human beings that live in these dwellings were more like lesser organisms, or something to that effect. They're just ants or something feeding off of something that was much bigger than them. And that's even expressed in the actions that are demonstrated by the people within the excerpt, right? So the population, there's never really names. The population of these little dwellings that encroach upon the castle express themselves by creating their own wooden structures and presenting them to the little person that lives in the big, powerful building. And then one is chosen, or several are chosen, and those are the special ones, and the others are destroyed. And as a reward for being chosen, the little inhabitants or populace of the encroaching buildings get to dwell for a specific moment in the bigger dwelling place.
Or at least, yeah, along the outskirts. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of total absurdity to everything that they're doing. Like I mean, desperation and meaninglessness and kind of absurdity. Like, why all the other ones have to be burnt is not explained. And then where does it say? I love this part. It was customary for him to stand there at the time of the burning and to bow his head silently as if in pain. So there's this kind of like theatrical meaninglessness to it, but then they just keep accumulating these carvings, but there's no sense of like appreciation of art, or you just get a sense of a very denigrated beauty. And one thing that actually ended up popping out to me in both of these is that the adornments within the castle have this very important relationship with like how you understand like the experience of the castle. So it's not just like the actual structure and a castle, how magical or how sinister, what have you. The tapestries or the carvings or things like that like kind of play a fundamental role. So its capacity to kind of accumulate works of art and establish a standard for like legends and tradition and works of art is really important too. It's like this kind of magnets or I guess that's the best word I can come up with right now. Magnet for like, for an aesthetic standard of an era too. But then it becomes like very passe after a while. So,
but again, it's all material and more of an attribute of the building than of the occupants inside.
Yes. So I would say so this is like the castle. In the second one, the castle contains everyone and it determines and sets the stage for the ritual and the whole atmosphere. Whereas in the first one, the castle is explored as a projection of a fantasy, although that fantasy is projected from within another castle, which is important to note.
Oh,
it's
I'm
not
glad
like
you
he's
noted
just
that.
like, because I mean, he's walking past tapestries and he's ascending towers and things like that.
He is.
Yeah, or he thinks he is. Or he could very well be walking to catch the bus or something like that. In a very complex delusion about dragons and tapestries.
Yes. So based on this discussion of the two, and your reading of them. I think I'm ready to guess which one of these I believe that you wrote.
Okay.
Okay. Well, unless you have tricked me very effectively, which to be fair, you sometimes do. I think that you wrote the first story.
I did write the first story.
Oh.
How did you guess?
It was the language mostly. I think because when I'm writing and I'm trying to describe or create a scene, I think words like in the very beginning, within the first few sentences, I suspected it was you. Words like describing the sun is streaming and suffusing in the tapestries, the way that you created the image and kind of the vocabulary you use, it made me think that's how I would try to capture something. And related, so that would be how you did it too.
I think that the problem with doing a podcast with a close relative,
yes, but
is becoming apparent.
But more definitively, having I think it was the juxtaposition of the scenario of a dethroned king, this romantic figure within this beautiful scenario and surroundings and poetry, being followed by the kind of the coldly or coolly clinical psychiatrist, and I think the way that they were put together, I liked, but it sounded very familiar to me. I don't even know anymore if that's because I would have written that way or that's because you tend to write things. It just sounded very familiar.
I mean, the contrast was extremely appealing to me. Yeah, so I did write the first one. The first one, though, is it's largely based on a real story.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the Disney castle, because in Germany, I saw the castle that the Disney castle is modeled after, like the one that it takes as its basis. Neuschwanstein, it's called. It's in Bavaria. And it was built by Ludwig II, who was the last king of Bavaria, and he's also known as the Mad King. And he was obsessed with castles in the late and mid 19th century. And Neuschwanstein was like his grandiose expression to loving castles, loving the idea of being an absolute monarch, which he really loved.
Wishing he lived in North Korea.
Yeah, something like that. And he also grew up in it was built basically on his father's estate, his father's country castle, which was also kind of a faux castle that was built in the 1830s and looks kind of like a Spanish colonial thing. And it's full of like these kind of these scenes. There are all these big painted frescoes of knights and dragons and fair damsels and all these legends that inspired Wagner. They're both obsessed with Wagner and Wagnerian operas. And so the inside of Ludwig's castle, in addition to having swans and a bed cathedral and not letting anyone else go in there, in a throne room that set him up as like some sort of like Byzantine monarch from the 8th century in 1865. It also had yeah, he basically didn't want anyone else to come in. So it's this interesting expression of like a castle fantasy. And indeed, most of the castles that one sees in Germany, and this is for anyone who is thinking of going to see castles in Germany, they're all from the 19th century. There are a couple ruins left.
Well, they were in vogue then, and some of them were even were deliberately creating ruins.
Yes,
for their gardens and things. Yes, that was a thing.
There's a romantic fad with ruins, and then but I mean, these people were like, oh, I read a book about this castle, I'm gonna build it, and they would elaborately.
Right. And that was reflected by the literary movement of that time as well.
Yes. So Gothic novels and romanticism and things like that correspond with this revival. But people visit them. Like Neuschwanstein gets 1.5 million visitors a year. That's a lot of people. Like half the population of the planet has been to this castle. It's a machine. Like you buy your ticket, you wait in line for like 2 hours at 9 a.m. and then you get assigned a time, and the turnstile, because it's Germany, opens at the exact second that time is, and then you get exactly 20 minutes of a guided tour, and then off you go. And they just it's like an assembly line. So there's a lot of people that go to it, and it's really popular. So people are obsessed with this thing. It's amazing. I'll post pictures or something like that. But it's interesting that it was basically he spent all the money building this castle, and then he was proclaimed mad because he spent, the budget of the state building these castles. and he died under mysterious circumstances and was probably gay. There are a lot of theories about that. So there's a libidinal quality that I wanted to capture. And then now it makes this, the state of Bavaria like €1 billion a year or something crazy.
So if there is heaven, he's looking down saying, "You're welcome."
I know, yeah. So it ended up being precisely because it was so extravagant. His extravagant Bavarian fantasy. So that's the first one. And the second one is from a book that I love, even though I've only just started it. I started about a year ago, and then I forgot about it and had other things going on. But it's called Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake.
Mm.
And I love the language. I love the tone. I love a certain ponderous architectural quality. I like the one reviewer describes it as a mix of Beowulf and Kafka. But I love the setting and the absurdity of it. And I think this is just the opening 2 paragraphs that I read. I just started at the beginning. So that's how it starts. Except it doesn't say the castle. It says Gormenghast. I wasn't sure if you would have read it or heard it. So I eliminated proper nouns. But yeah, so I highly recommend it, and definitely something that I want to get back into. Very funny in like a dark, absurdist kind of way. And it really exploits the atmosphere.
I don't know. It's so dark absurdism as a humor, I generally doesn't work well with me because I already see the world as darkly absurd. And so the humor is more depressing than anything else. I'm like, yeah, I know. I see what you're saying.
Well, this is very removed from everyday existence. I mean, there's a certain sense of like ceremonial absurdity, let's say, because they do things without any reason. But I mean, you have no idea what country you're in or what time exactly. And then there's adventures and intrigues that kind of take place within. But I think it would be difficult to find it depressing. Because it's quite funny. Kind of imagine like, did you ever read Pilgrim's Progress?
Mm-hmm.
Certain characters like that almost seem to be like allegories of like sloth or decadence or vanity or lust or whatever. Like they're all the names
the
are
Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales.
Yeah, it really comes from like a great like British tradition that I don't know well enough. I guess it would be something like English Baroque, but I really enjoy its ornate language, I guess, and the contrast of the solemn and the ridiculous. So anyway, you guessed well. I'm gonna have to start getting more stylistically creative, but I did write this 2 hours ago. So.
Okay. Well, I will conclude by stating that these stories have in 2 instances reminded me of Cogsworth from Beauty and the Beast. Your utilization of the word buttresses, which I appreciated, yes. As well as your most recent mention of the word Baroque, and as he quibs, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it.
I mean, I'm gonna keep my love for the Disney, the original Disney
Beauty palaces. Yeah. Is it the Beauty and the Beast castle that they were supposed to mirror off of the Disney castle?
I thought it was Cinderella, actually.
Or was it?
But I could be wrong. But anyway, it's Neuschwanstein. It's the same outline and stuff. I mean, I can show you pictures. It's a very dramatic drop, and there's a ravine, and you climb up a mountain, and you see it. It really does do something to you. I like the forest around castles more than castles. I learned that about myself. There's something about it that does exert a tremendous fascination, and people spend a lot of money to go see these things. So. It was worth contemplating, but
that's awesome.
Next time you encounter a castle,
I will definitely have to check it out. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And so we conclude our 10th episode of The Non-Existent Story.
Ciao.
Ciao.